The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus spoke this parable to his disciples. The kingdom of heaven is like a man on his way abroad, who summoned his servants and entrusted them property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to a third 1, each in proportion to his ability. Then he set out. The man who had received the 5 talents promptly went and traded with them and made 5 more. The man who had received 2 made 2 more in the same way. But the man who had received 1 went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now a long time after, the master of those servants came back and went through his accounts with them. The man who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more. "Sir," he said, "you entrusted me with 5 talents. Here are 5 more that I have made." His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have shown you can be faithful in small things. I will trust you with greater. Come and join in your master's happiness." Next, the man with the 2 talents came forward. "Sir," he said, "you entrusted me with 2 talents. Here are 2 more that I have made." His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have shown you can be faithful in small things. I will trust you with greater. Come and join in your master's happiness." Last came forward the man who had the 1 talent. "Sir," he said, "I had heard you were a hard man, reaping where you had not sown and gathering where you have not scattered. So I was afraid, and I went off and hid your talent in the ground. Here it is, it was yours, you have it back." But his master answered him, "You wicked and lazy servant. So you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered. Well then, you should have deposited my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have recovered my capital with interest. So now, take the talent from him and give it to the man who has the 5 talents. For to everyone who has will be given more, and he will have more than enough. But from the man who has not, even what he has will be taken away. As for this good-for-nothing servant, throw him out into the dark, where there will be weeping and grinding of teeth." The Gospel of the Lord. To understand that parable, it's helpful to know what a talent is, or was. It's a Greek measure, not of money, but of weight. So it's like saying a ton or whatever. It's a large amount, and in this case, the weight refers to the weight of silver, probably. So it's a very large amount of money, worth of money, right? So when we're saying 5 talents, it's probably saying something like 5 tons of silver or 5 tons of gold. An enormous amount in our days reckoning. It's said that it's something like 1 talent was about 15 years worth of wages for a working man. That's quite a lot of money that was entrusted to each servant. Now, a lot of people, when we read this reading, the first kind of thing that we think about is a kind of moral tale. We're thinking in terms of, well, God has given me these talents, which is where we get the English word from, actually. It's from this parable. A talent, we're talented, and so on. God has given us these gifts, and we're to use them well, so that one day when we come to die and we're judged, we'll be judged favourably because we've used all the talents and the gifts that God has given us. Well, that's a reasonable interpretation, a moral kind of interpretation of the story. But when we place it in its context in Matthew's Gospel, we see in fact it's much richer and deeper than that. And Matthew is using it in a slightly different way from this kind of moral application of the story. So it's in chapter 25. So that's in the last of Matthew's 5 sections. And this last section is dealing with the coming of the kingdom of God. And it deals with his confrontation with the scribes and the Pharisees, especially chapter 23, with all the woes and to the scribes and the Pharisees who weigh out burdens on men's shoulders and won't lift them and things like that. And it deals with the last times, what we call eschatology, the last times to come. And the coming of Jesus, coming back to judge, and that's called the parousia. So it's all that kind of context in which we've got this parable. A bit before is about, we've got the 10 virgins, the 5 foolish and the 5 wise, who had their lamps lit or didn't have enough oil or did bring spare oil. And then we have this parable, and then we've got what next Sunday's gospel is about, is judgment according to the way we've lived our lives. So the context of this parable is about the end times and what's going to happen to us and how we need to prepare for the end times. That's why he mentions that the man who goes off on his journey, after a long time, he comes back and then has a reckoning of the accounts. Now there were the 2 good, sensible, industrious servants who traded with their money and made a lot more, doubled what they'd got. And they were rewarded for what they'd done, and the reward was that they were going to have the joy of their master, to enter into his joy. So the idea that the kingdom of God in this sense is heaven, really, at the end of the world, at the end of our life. The experience of heaven is a joyful experience of being in God's company, the master's company. Now the third man, well, what did he do? He hid his money in the ground. Now in Jesus' time, if you were entrusted with money and you hid it in the ground, that was considered a safe place to be, safe from burglars, thieves. And so you were not held accountable if that money was lost, it had been stolen, if you put it in the ground. Unlike Luke's sort of parable that's very similar to this, when the man hides the money in a piece of cloth, in that instance you were liable for the loss of the money. It's quite an interesting little bit. That the man thought that it was safe, but in fact it wasn't safe because he hadn't used it well. And when Matthew was writing to his community, the Jewish Christian community, the Jewish Christians would have been aware of what was developing amongst the Jews of his time, which was what they called putting a fence around the law. They called protect the law, put a fence around the law so it can't be changed. So there's no spreading of the law amongst the Gentile people and so on. We're just enclosed. And it's thought that perhaps one of the reasons why Matthew included this parable, and perhaps related in this particular way, was he was really covertly referring to the Jewish people of the time who were developing a Judaism that was totally separate, rather sort of fossilized, and wasn't allowed to develop and breathe, as it were, using the talents that the master had given them. So really there's a kind of little indictment against that kind of development of Judaism of Matthew's time. We don't use it, of course, as an idea for anti-Semitism, of course. But that's possibly why Matthew was using it, because of the friction between the Jewish Christians and the non-Christian Jews of his time. So this man, he hid his money in the ground, and then when he says it was because of fear. But when the master comes to make a judgment, he says it was because you were wicked and lazy, which might make us think, well, perhaps are our motives right? When we consider the reasons for doing or not doing something, do we really understand what's going on? And of course God understands our interior intentions perhaps better than we do ourselves. So another little aside of this little parable, it's not so little, actually a big parable, is to have a good self-knowledge and understand what we're doing. So he said, put it in the bank and you'll recover it with interest. Take it from the man who has the 5 talents and give them to him. And at the end of it, there's this judgment that he will go, the Greek says he will go far away to the darkness that's a long way off. So there's this sense of the heaven, which is the joy of being in God's presence, and the judgment of being in the place of darkness, so far away from God, being away from his presence, where there won't be joy. And the consequence of not having joy is the weeping and grinding of teeth. So here we get a very good picture of what Matthew's saying Christianity should be about, and our goal of getting to heaven is it should be joyful. We should have a joyful experience of God in this world, that we might have an eternity of joy with him in heaven.